A cargo ship stands upright in dry sand, 400 meters from the nearest wave. Nobody moved it. The desert walked out and took it. This is Namibia's Skeleton Coast, 500 kilometers of shore, between the Kunene and the Ugab, with no harbor, no town, no drinkable water. Cold Atlantic water under hot desert air builds fog that reaches 50 kilometers inland, and ships have driven blind into the beach here since 1533. But fog only explains the grounding. It does not explain the graveyard. Crews usually survived the impact. The question is what happened once they reached shore. Start with the shape of the place, because the shape is the trap. Run your eye up the Atlantic edge of Namibia from Walvis Bay. Walvis Bay is a real port, sheltered by a sand spit, deep enough for container ships, and it is the last one. North of it there is Swakopmund, which is a town with a beach and no harbor worth the name. Then Henties Bay, a fishing settlement. Then Cape Cross, a seal colony and a salt works. And then the coast simply stops offering anything. From the Ugab River northward to the Kunene, which is the border with Angola, you have roughly 500 kilometers of shoreline with no port, no sheltered anchorage, no lee, no breakwater, no tug on standby, and until very recently, no reliable way to call for help that did not involve a radio operator hoping somebody was listening on the right frequency at the right hour. That is the Skeleton Coast in the strict sense. The Ugab is where the park gate stands. In ordinary use, the name runs further south, down past the Swakop and beyond, because the same current, the same fog, and the same surf carry on down the whole Namibian shore. Several of the wrecks everyone associates with this coast are south of that gate, and they were taken by exactly the same machinery. The first fact that matters here is not a scenic one. It is operational. On most coastlines in the world, a ship in trouble has a decision tree. Engine failing? Make for the nearest port. Weather building? Duck behind a headland? Taking water? Beach her somewhere shallow and protected and wait for a salvage tug. Every one of those options is a place. Here the places do not exist. A master who realizes at 2 in the morning that something is wrong has, in practical terms, one option. Turn west into open ocean, away from the thing that is killing him. And that option is only available if he knows where he is, which, for most of the history of this coast, he did not. Namibia's coastal desert is the Namib, and the strip along the water is about as dry as land gets. Rainfall on the coastal belt rarely exceeds about 10 millimeters in a year. Not 10 centimeters, 10 millimeters. There are stretches where measurable rain does not fall for years at a stretch, and where the entire moisture budget of the ecosystem arrives as fog condensing on gravel, on rock, on the backs of beetles that have evolved to stand facing the wind and drink what runs down their own shells. Inland from the shore, the numbers improve slightly, and some sources give the wider desert region up to around 50 millimeters. But the difference is academic to a person standing on the beach. There is no surface fresh water. None. The rivers that cross this coast, the Ugab, the Huab, the Uniab, the Hoanib, the Hoarusib, the Kumib, are ephemeral. They are riverbeds, not rivers. They flow above ground for a few days a year at most, when rain falls in the highlands 200 kilometers inland, and the rest of the time they are dry channels of sand and gravel, with water moving slowly beneath them, out of sight, out of reach of anyone without local knowledge and something to dig with. So the geography has already done 2 things before any weather arrives. It has removed the option of diverting to shelter, and it has made the shore itself lethal to reach. Most coastlines punish you for hitting them. This one punishes you for surviving the hit. Now add the water. The Benguela Current runs north along this coast, and it is cold, not cool. Cold. It carries water up from the Southern Ocean, and along the Namibian shelf, the prevailing southerly and Saharian southwesterly winds push the surface layer offshore, which pulls water up from depth to replace it. That is upwelling, and here it is one of the most vigorous upwelling systems on the planet. Water arrives at the surface from a few hundred meters down, carrying nitrate and phosphate that have been accumulating in the dark for years. Sea surface temperatures off Walvis Bay routinely sit in the low to mid-teens Celsius, while the sand 100 meters inland is hot enough to blister skin. Hold that contrast, because it is the engine of everything that follows. Air sitting on cold water gets chilled from below. It becomes saturated. It cannot hold the moisture it is carrying at that lower temperature, and the moisture condenses into droplets. That is fog, and specifically, it is advection fog, which means fog that forms because air has moved over a colder surface rather than because the ground cooled overnight. Then, the sea breeze pushes that fog bank inland. It crosses the beach, and here, the desert does something cruel. The air above the hot sand is warmer and lighter, so the cold marine layer cannot rise through it. It gets pinned under an inversion, a lid of warm air a few hundred meters up, and it slides inland underneath that lid as a dense gray river. It can reach 50 kilometers from the water. On the coast itself, it can persist through the night and well into the morning, day after day, for much of the year. The people of this region have a word for it that came down from the north, Kasimbo. And the fog has been part of the working reality here for as long as anyone has kept records. Now put a bridge under it. You are on a ship at night, closing a coastline that has no lights on it. There are no towns to glow, no harbor entrance beacons, no headlands to give you a radar echo that means anything, because the shore here is low, flat, and featureless for hundreds of kilometers in both directions. The land does not announce itself. There is no cliff, no mountain backdrop, no change in the note of the sea. What there is a shelving bottom and a line of surf. And the surf is the only warning you get. And by the time you hear it over your own engines, you are already inside it. That is the mechanism in its simplest form. Fog removes the coastline before navigation becomes critical. You do not lose sight of the land at the dangerous moment. You lost sight of it hours ago, and you have been running on dead reckoning. Course, speed, elapsed time, an estimate of current, ever since. Dead reckoning is not guessing. It is arithmetic, and it is good arithmetic in the hands of a competent officer, but it accumulates error. Every hour without a fix, the box of possible positions gets bigger, and the Benguela sets north at a rate that varies with wind and season, which means the error is not random. It is biased. It pushes you somewhere specific, and if your assumption about the set is wrong by even a fraction of a knot, 6 hours of it puts you kilometers from where the chart line says you are. Kilometers on a coast where the water goes from 60 meters to breaking surf in a distance you can walk in 10 minutes. There is one more piece, and it is the piece that turns a grounding into a graveyard. The swell here arrives predominantly from the southwest, generated by the great low-pressure systems that spin eastward across the Southern Ocean, thousands of kilometers away. It has crossed open water with nothing to interrupt it. When a long swell runs into shallow water, it does not simply get smaller. It gets shorter, steeper, and faster breaking. The wave slows at the bottom while the top keeps its momentum. The crest stacks up, and the whole thing topples forward. That is why surf exists at all. On a beach with a sandbar offshore, which describes most of this coastline, the waves break on the bar, reform in the trough behind it, and break again on the sand. A vessel that touches the bar is not sitting in the sea anymore. She is sitting in the impact zone. Chismabon Mesiazamin, taking a strike every 8 to 12 seconds, in the same place, from the same direction, indefinitely. And those sandbars move. They are built and rebuilt by the swell and the longshore drift, and on a coast, this exposed, they can be somewhere different from one season to the next. Charting them is close to pointless. The British Admiralty charts of this region were, for a very long time, honest about their own uncertainty. Surveys were old, sparse, and sometimes contradictory, and there are hazards here that appear on charts in one position and turn out, when a ship finds them the hard way, to be somewhere else entirely. One of them has a name that tells the whole story. About 8 kilometers off the shore, south of the Kunene mouth, lies a reef, and it is called the Clan Alpine Shoal, because on the 13th of January 1890, a British steamship called the Clan Alpine found it while running from Tilbury to Cape Town. The shoal did not have a name before that. It got one from the ship it destroyed. And more than half a century later, the Admiralty's picture of exactly where that rock lay was still imprecise enough that another British ship would drive onto the same hazard at speed, at night, in wartime, with 106 people aboard. That reef is going to matter again, and when it does, there will be 106 people on the ship it stops. But before any of this, before the charts, before the steam engines, before the word Namibia existed, this coast already had a reputation, and it is worth asking what people actually saw that gave it one. In 1486, a Portuguese navigator named Diogo Canho came south along this shore, under orders from King John II to find the sea route to the Indies and to mark Portugal's claim as he went. The marking was done with padrões, stone crosses, cut in Lisbon, carried in the hold, and planted on prominent points. Canho planted one on a low headland about 120 kilometers north of what is now Swakopmund, and the place has been called Cape Cross ever since. The inscription dated the world from creation and the cross from the birth of Christ, and recorded that the king had ordered this land discovered, and this padrão erected here. It stood for 4 centuries and became a genuine navigational mark for anyone working this coast, which tells you something in itself. On a shoreline with no features, a 2-meter pillar of Lisbon limestone was the most reliable landmark available. A German naval officer removed the original in 1893 and shipped it to Berlin, where it sat in a museum until it was returned to Namibia in 2019. Replicas stand at the Cape now. Canho did not find a route to the Indies here. He found what every subsequent mariner found: a shore that offered no water, no shelter, no trade, and no reason to stop, guarded by surf. Portuguese sailors called this stretch of coast the Gates of Hell. Inland, the San, called the land God made in anger. 2 entirely separate traditions, one arriving by sea and one already living in the interior, arrived at the same verdict and used the same register to say it. That agreement matters more than it looks. Reputations of this kind are usually built by a specific event that people remember. Here, the reputation predates the record. It came from a pattern, not from a disaster. From generations of seamen who could see from a mile offshore that there was nothing there and no way in. They were reading the physics without the vocabulary. No estuary means no shelter. Continuous surf means no landing. No vegetation means no fresh water. A haze that never lifts means no fix. You do not need instruments to conclude that this is a coast to be given a wide berth. And for centuries, that is precisely what ships did. The trouble is that giving a coast a wide berth requires knowing where you are relative to it. On Friday, the 7th of March, 1533, a Portuguese nau left Lisbon for India. Her name was the Bom Jesus, and she was part of the machinery of the richest trade route on earth. Understand what a nau on the India run actually was, because it explains the decisions. She was a big, high-sided merchant ship built to carry cargo around the Cape of Good Hope and back. A voyage that took the better part of a year in each direction and killed crews wholesale through scurvy, dysentery, and shipwreck. Portugal accepted those losses because the arithmetic worked. A ship that came home from Cochin or Goa with pepper and spices returned a profit that made the risk rational at a national level, if not at an individual one. The outbound cargo was money in physical form. The Bom Jesus carried more than 40 tons of it, something like 17 tons of copper ingots, over 1,800 of them. Thousands of gold and silver coins, cannon, muskets, swords, navigational instruments, textiles. Copper was the trade good. Coin was the working capital. The instruments were the ship's own nervous system. Her route took her down the Atlantic on the standard sailing plan of the age, which was not a straight line. To get around Africa under sail, you swung out west toward Brazil to pick up the trade winds, then curved back southeast to run down into the westerlies that would carry you around the Cape. That great arc meant that on the return leg of the curve you closed the African coast somewhere in the latitudes of what is now Namibia and Angola. And you did it with only a rough idea of your longitude because there was no method of finding longitude at sea that worked. Latitude you could get from the sun or the pole star with a cross staff or an astrolabe. East-west position was estimated, and the estimate was the weakest number on the ship. The Bom Jesus was doing what she was built to do on the route she was meant to take. With an experienced crew in the condition of apparent control that every one of these stories starts from. What went wrong is not documented because nobody who could write survived to write it, and the ship simply failed to arrive. What the evidence suggests is that she was driven too close to the coast in a storm, struck rock, and broke up. The heavy cargo went to the bottom immediately. Copper ingots do not float and do not drift. Neither do cannon. They went down in a heap, in shallow water, a short distance from a shoreline near the mouth of the Orange River, in what is now southern Namibia, well south of the Skeleton Coast proper, on the same coastal system, subject to the same swell. And then the Atlantic buried her, and for 475 years nobody knew where she was. Here is where it gets strange. In April 2008, mining crews working for Namdeb, the joint operation between the Namibian state and De Beers, were stripping a stretch of ground near Oranjemund that had been seabed until they drained it. The company mines diamonds on the shore and just offshore, and the method involves building a seawall, pumping the water out from behind it, and taking the exposed sediment apart. A De Beers man named Keapanda Shataka found copper ingots and elephant tusks lying in it. Work stopped. An archaeologist, Dieter Noli, was brought in. And what came out of that hole over the following months was the oldest and richest shipwreck ever recovered from the west coast of sub-Saharan Africa. More than 2,000 gold and silver coins, the stacked copper, over 100 elephant tusks weighing about 2 tons, tin, weapons, and the compasses and dividers of a working 16th century navigator. The coins carried the emblem of John III, de John III of Portugal, and dated the wreck to the 1530s. Portuguese records for a missing ship of the right description gave her a name. There is a reason so much of her survived, and it is chemistry rather than luck. Copper is toxic to the organisms that eat wood at sea. The Bom Jesus went down with something like 17 tons of it stacked in her hold, and as the ingots corroded, they poisoned the immediate environment against shipworm and boring mollusks, which is why timber, rope, and textile survived on that site when they would have vanished on almost any other. The cargo preserved the ship. Then the sand covered both, sealing the whole assemblage away from oxygen, and the Atlantic quietly moved the shoreline seaward over it, until the wreck was no longer in the sea at all, which is how a Portuguese Indiaman ended up being excavated by mining engineers with pumps, rather than by divers with airlifts. The ingots themselves carried a maker's mark, a trident, which has been linked to the Fugger merchant and banking house of Augsburg, the financiers who supplied much of the copper moving through Lisbon in that period. That single stamp connects a hole in the Namibian sand to the credit system of 16th century Europe, and it tells you what this ship really was. Not an adventure, a shipment. Now the part that should stop you. They found almost no people, a few scattered bone fragments, and that is all. 40 tons of cargo preserved in extraordinary detail: textiles, ivory, iron, timber, and essentially no human remains. There are only two explanations, and neither one is comfortable. Either the crew were washed away and lost at sea, in which case the coast took them and kept nothing, or a substantial number of them got ashore, alive, and then died somewhere the archaeology has not looked and probably never will. We do not know which. Nobody should pretend otherwise. But we do know something about what would have happened to men who reached that beach, because the physics has not changed since 1533. Assume the best case. Assume the ship struck close in daylight, and men made it through the surf. They arrive on a beach with no fresh water within any distance they can walk in the state they are in. They are soaked and hypothermic. The Benguela is cold enough to take the strength out of a swimmer in under an hour. And within a few hours of sunrise, they will be in the opposite emergency, on sand that can exceed 50 degrees, with no shade and no cover. There is no wood on that shore to build with. There is no vegetation to eat. The sea has fish in enormous numbers and no way to catch them without gear. The fog rolls in at night and puts moisture on every surface, which is the one gift the desert gives, and a man who did not already know to lick condensation off a cold rock at dawn would not think of it in time. Then comes the decision that killed people on this coast for 4 centuries: which way to walk. Every instinct says follow the shore. It is flat, it is navigable, it is a line you cannot get lost on, and it is where a rescuing ship would look for you. It is also, on this coast, a corridor of pure exposure with no water at any point along its length. Walking north or south along the beach from a wreck site in this region can mean 200 kilometers to anything resembling a settlement, over sand and gravel, in that heat without a bottle. A fit, hydrated, equipped man can cover 40 kilometers a day on that surface. A dehydrated survivor cannot do a quarter of it, and the shortfall is not linear. Dehydration takes your judgment before it takes your legs. The survivable direction is inland, up a dry riverbed, away from the sea. It is the direction that looks like suicide. That is not hindsight. It is the operating principle of everybody who has ever lived successfully in this landscape, and it is worth spending a moment on, because it reframes the entire coast. The people of the Caucoveld, the Himba, and related Ochi-Herero-speaking communities of northwestern Namibia have occupied this region as semi-nomadic herders for centuries, and their relationship with the coastal strip is precise and instructive. They do not live on it. They live inland, and they use the ephemeral river corridors, which are the only lines in the landscape where water is reliably present, not present on the surface, present under it. A dry riverbed like the Honib or the Hoarusib is a linear aquifer. Rain that fell in the highlands weeks or months earlier moves down through the sand at walking pace, and in specific places, the outside of a bend, upstream of a rock bar, where the bedrock rises close to the surface. It can be reached by digging a hole in the riverbed a meter or 2 deep. Those places are known. They are known the way you know the layout of your own house. They are not marked, they do not look different to an outsider, and the knowledge of where they are is the difference between the desert being habitable and being fatal. The same logic governs everything else. Where the corridors have water, they have trees, ana trees, tamarisks, and where there are trees, there is browse, and where there is browse, you can put cattle and goats. Elephants use the same corridors for the same reason, and desert-adapted lions follow, sometimes all the way to the coast to take seals and cormorants. The whole ecosystem of this region is organized as a series of green threads running east to west through dead ground. And the people who live here have organized themselves the same way, mobile, dispersed, keeping the herd moving, never staying anywhere long enough to exhaust the water. None of that is endurance. Calling it endurance misses the point entirely. It is restraint. It is a system of self-imposed limits. How long you may stay, how many animals the corridor will carry when you must move, which route you may take between one water point and the next. And it works because the limits are obeyed. There is coastal foraging too, and always has been. People have worked the shore for seals, seabirds, shellfish, and stranded whales for a very long time. But it is done as a visit from an inland base, with water carried or with a known source behind you, and then you leave. Which produces the first genuine reversal in this story. The Skeleton Coast is not a place where people cannot survive. People have lived within a day's walk of it, comfortably, for centuries. It is a place where survival requires knowing exactly where the water is, and where the penalty for not knowing is close to absolute. The shipwrecked sailor has the worst possible combination. He arrives at the point of maximum distance from water, in the worst possible physical condition, with no local knowledge, facing a decision where the correct answer is counterintuitive, and the incorrect answer is the one every survival instinct demands. He walks along the beach, because the beach is where ships are, and the beach has nothing. So when the archaeologists at Oranjemund found 40 tons of cargo and a handful of bone fragments, the absence is not evidence that everyone drowned. It is not evidence that anyone lived either. It is a hole in the record shaped exactly like this coast. The sea keeps the metal, and the land does not bother to keep the men. That question does not get answered. It stays open for the next 400 years, and every wreck adds to it, and the coast keeps producing the same result with better and better ships, because the ships did get better. That is the part nobody expects. A sailing ship is terrified of a lee shore. That is not a metaphor. It is the central anxiety of the entire age of sail. If the wind is blowing you toward land and you cannot beat off against it, you die. And every master learned that before he learned anything else. Which means sailing ships on the Namibian coast behaved with a very particular kind of caution. They stayed out. They gave the land tens of kilometers of margin because they knew that if they got embayed in fog, with a southwesterly behind them, there was nothing they could do about it. The caution was not virtue, it was arithmetic. Steam abolished that arithmetic, and with it the caution. A steamer does not care which way the wind is blowing. A steamer can hold a course, hold a speed, and make her passage on a schedule. And from the 1860s onward, the traffic down the west coast of Africa became exactly that, scheduled. Mail contracts, coal, passenger liners running between Europe and Cape Town. And the shortest line between 2 points on this coast runs close to it, so ships began to run close to it, at a steady 12 or 13 knots, at night, in fog, with total confidence in their engines and no way at all to see where they were going. The confidence was justified. The visibility was not. Then a second pressure arrived, and this one dragged ships not merely past the coast, but onto it deliberately. The same upwelling that makes the fog makes the fish, and the fish make the birds, and the birds, for centuries, on the offshore rocks and headlands of this coast, made guano. In the middle of the 19th century, guano was one of the most valuable bulk commodities in the world, a nitrogen and phosphate fertilizer that European agriculture had become dependent on, and the deposits on the islands and headlands off southwestern Africa were worth going after. So sailing vessels and small steamers began anchoring off open beaches on the most dangerous coast in the South Atlantic in order to load bird droppings. There is a whole category of wreck here that exists only because of that trade. In 1896, the Erycina, loading guano for the United Kingdom north of Cape Cross, sprang a leak in rough weather and was lost. She was not passing. She was working, in a place where working means lying at anchor with no shelter, in swell, on a coast where the wind can go from calm to gale in an afternoon. Whaling and sealing did the same thing for the same reason. The Benguela's productivity, concentrated animals here in numbers, that justified the risk of coming in to take them, and the shore accumulated bones, whale bones, seal bones, in piles, bleaching. That is the image most people carry when they hear this coast's name. And it is worth saying now that the name did not come from those bones, and did not come from the wrecks either. Where it actually came from is stranger, and it arrives much later in this story. For a long stretch of the 19th century, the skeletons on that beach were neither human nor maritime. They were industrial waste. By the 1880s, the traffic was heavy enough that the coast began to take ships in a pattern rather than as isolated incidents. And on the 13th of January 1890, the pattern produced a wreck that would matter 52 years later. The Clan Alpine was a British steamship of 1878, running from Tilbury to Cape Town, and she struck an uncharted reef about 8 kilometers off the coast, south of the Cunene mouth. At roughly 18 degrees south, she was lost. The reef acquired her name, which is a convention as old as navigation. You name the hazard after the ship it kills, because that is the only way anyone will remember it. And it went on to the Admiralty charts as the Clan Alpine Shoal. On to the charts, but not precisely. That distinction deserves more attention than it usually gets. Putting a hazard on a chart requires knowing where the hazard is, and knowing where a submerged rock is, 8 kilometers off ashore, with no reference points, in the 1890s, meant sending a survey vessel to a coast with no harbor, no fresh water, and no reason for anyone to want to be there, and having her lie in swell-taking soundings with a lead line while trying to fix her own position by sextant angles on landmarks that do not exist. It was not done properly. The Admiralty's own charts carried the shoal with an acknowledged uncertainty about its exact location, and that uncertainty was still there in the Second World War. Think about what that means in practice for a navigator. A hazard with a known position you avoid by a mile. A hazard with an uncertain position you must avoid by the size of the uncertainty. And if you do not know the size of the uncertainty, you cannot know how far off is far enough. The chart tells you there is a rock. It does not tell you that the rock might be somewhere else. A cautious master gives it a wide berth. A master running a wartime schedule, hugging the coast for reasons we will get to, gives it what he thinks is a wide berth. The German colonial period brought the next escalation, and it brought it because of a war on land. Germany claimed Southwest Africa in 1884, and its whole logistical position depended on the sea, because there was no other way in. The territory's usable ports were Swakopmund, which was not a harbor, but an open roadstead with a jetty, where cargo and passengers were transferred through surf into lighters, and where a swell could stop all work for days. And Walvis Bay, which was the only real harbor and which the British held as an enclave. Everything the colony consumed came over that beach. Every soldier, every horse, every rail, every sack of flour. Then, in 1904, the Herero and Nama rose against German rule, and the German response was a colonial war of extraordinary brutality that ended in what is now widely recognized as a genocide. The military logistics of that campaign put an enormous volume of shipping onto this coast under time pressure, and time pressure is the single most reliable predictor of maritime disaster in any era. In 1904, the Gertrude Verman II went ashore about 15 kilometers north of Swakopmund. She was carrying around 400 passengers and 300 horses for the Schutztruppe. Everyone survived. A German gunboat, the Veneta, assisted in getting them off. But read that cargo manifest again. 300 horses on a ship approaching an open roadstead on a fog-bound coast, because the campaign needed cavalry mounts and needed them on a schedule. That is what exposure looks like. Nobody was being reckless. Somebody had signed a contract. Somebody had a delivery date. And the ship went where the contract said. And this is the point at which the coast starts producing its signature result, the one that separates it from every other notorious shoreline in the world. On most dangerous coasts, The ship and the people are lost together. Here they separate. The Gertrude Veerman II. 400 people ashore. Ship gone. Over and over, across every era, the same split. The surf drives the vessel onto the bar and holds her there while it destroys her. And it also drives her boats, and her people, and her wreckage, landward onto the beach, because everything the surf touches goes one direction. Landward. That is the whole trick, and it took me a while to see how elegant and horrible it is. The surf on this coast is a valve. It passes things in one direction only. A boat launched from a stricken ship pulling for the beach is going with the break. It will be thrown around, it may broach, it may capsize, but it will arrive, and the people in it will very likely arrive too because the water is pushing them where they are already trying to go. Turn that boat around and try to pull back out through the same surf and you cannot do it. Every oncoming wave stops the boat dead and pushes her back. To get out through a heavy break, you need speed and power that a pulling boat, or a small motorboat, simply does not have. And you need to hit each wave square before it breaks, and you need to do it repeatedly for several hundred meters. In a heavy Benguela swell, it is not difficult. It is impossible. So the people get ashore, and then the shore has them. That sentence explains the graveyard. Not ships sink here. Ships mostly do not sink here. They ground in shallow water, close in, often with everyone alive. The Skeleton Coast's specialty is not drowning. It is delivery. It puts living people on a beach with no water, no shade, no shelter, and no way back to the sea. And then it waits. For 400 years, that was the end of the story. What changed everything, and what makes the modern wrecks stranger, not safer, is that people eventually found ways to come and get them. Overland, by air, by helicopter. Every one of those worked in the end. The first serious attempt to use them here cost a tug, an aircraft, and 2 men's lives, except that the shore does one further thing to a wreck, and there is a single ship standing in dry sand that demonstrates it better than any argument could. The Eduard Bolin was a 2,222-ton German cargo steamer, 94 meters long, working the colonial supply run. On the 5th of September 1909, she was on passage from Swakopmund south to Table Bay, which is about as routine as voyages get. A coastal run down a coast her officers had run many times, in a ship that was doing nothing unusual, at a speed that was nothing unusual. The fog came in thick. Understand what that meant on a steamer in 1909. There is no radar. There is no radio direction finding worth the name. There is no echo sounder. Depth is taken with a lead line, which requires slowing or stopping, and which gives you one number, from one moment at one point. The only tools are the compass, the log for speed, the clock, and the chart. In clear weather, you cross-check all of that against the land, a bearing on a headland, a distant hill, anything. In fog, you get nothing, and the errors compound silently. Her officers were doing the correct thing, which is the detail that makes the story worth telling. They were running on dead reckoning because there was nothing else to run on. And dead reckoning down this coast has a specific weakness. It does not know about the current. The Benguela sets north, roughly parallel to the shore, at a rate that varies. A southbound ship is punching into it. If the officer of the watch assumes half a knot of set and gets 1.5, then over a night watch he is several miles from where he thinks he is. And crucially, the error does not push him along the coast. Combined with the way the shoreline trends, it pushes him toward it. Then there is the second, quieter problem. Fog has a way of making a ship feel slow and safe. Sound does not carry properly through it. It deadens and misdirects, so the surf that ought to warn you arrives late and from the wrong bearing. There is no sensation of speed with no visible reference. And a ship's officer on a coastal passage in low visibility has an enormous incentive not to slow down, because slowing down means arriving late. And arriving late means explaining yourself to an owner who is paying for coal and time. She went onto the beach at Conception Bay, south of Sandwich Harbor, a long way south of the park gate on the same shore, under the same fog. At full speed, in thick mist. She was hard aground immediately and unsalvageable almost as immediately. The crew got off. She was so close in that getting off was straightforward, which is precisely the pattern. And that was the end of the Edward Boleyn as a ship. It was not the end of what she demonstrates. Within 10 days, so much sand had built up around her that a man could walk out to her from the beach at low tide without getting wet above the knee. 10 days. She had been floating in the ocean, and inside a fortnight, she was land. And then the shoreline kept coming. The Edward Boleyn today sits in the desert. Not near the desert, in it. Depending on which survey you take and how you define the waterline, the wreck lies somewhere between about 400 meters and rather more from the sea, with dry sand in every direction, corroded to a red-brown skeleton of frames and plating. And photographs of her taken from the air are genuinely disorienting, because the eye keeps trying to put water where water is not. Sources disagree on the exact figure, and they disagree partly because the answer keeps changing. Here is the mechanism, and getting it right matters, because it is the reversal. Sand on this coast is not local. Enormous quantities of sediment are delivered to the Atlantic by the Orange River, hundreds of kilometers to the south, and the northward flowing Benguela and the persistent southwesterly swell move that sediment up the coast in a conveyor. Longshore drift, wave by wave, grain by grain continuously, for as long as the current and the swell exist. Some of it stays in the surf zone, some of it comes ashore and is picked up by the prevailing wind and driven inland, which is where the Namib Sand Sea comes from. This coast is not eroding, it is accumulating. On a geological timescale, it is building seaward. Now put a large steel obstruction in the surf zone. The wreck acts as a groin. Sand moving along the coast hits it, loses energy, and drops out of the water column on the upstream side. A bar forms. The bar attaches to the beach widens. The surf, now breaking further out, deposits its load further out, and the process repeats, and the shoreline steps seaward past the obstruction that started it. The ship does not sink into the sand. The land grows out around her and keeps going. She was building her own tomb from the day she stopped moving, and she was doing it with material that had come 300 or 400 kilometers up the coast to arrive, which upends the thing you assume about shipwrecks. Everywhere else in the world, the sea takes the wreck. It breaks it, scatters it, drags it into deep water, and eventually erases it. That is the normal end. On the Skeleton Coast, the sea does not get the chance, because the ship never goes into deep water in the first place. She grounds in the shallows, in the one part of the ocean where sediment is being actively deposited. And the desert claims her instead. The evidence is not destroyed. It is buried, in place, sometimes with astonishing fidelity, which is exactly why the Bom Jesus came out of the ground near Oranjemund, with textiles and timber intact, after 475 years. And it explains something about the wreck counts that nobody says out loud. You will hear that there are over 1,000 wrecks on this coast. You will hear 500. You will hear hundreds. The honest answer is that nobody knows. And the reason nobody knows is buried in this mechanism. A substantial number of the wrecks on this coast are no longer visible from anywhere because they are under the beach. One former ranger of the Skeleton Coast Park documented 112 wrecks over 6 years of working the shoreline, which is the kind of number an actual person actually counted. The larger figures are estimates layered on estimates. A few hundred documented losses, A few hundred more inferred from records of ships that departed and never arrived. There is no authoritative register. There is no marine archaeology program systematically surveying 500 kilometers of restricted, roadless, harborless coast. The claim that this is the largest ship graveyard on Earth is a reputation, not an audit. And anybody who quotes you a precise number is quoting somebody else's guess. What is not in dispute is the mechanism, and the mechanism is worse than the number. A coast that hides its own wrecks will always be undercounted, and undercounting is how a hazard stays dangerous. So by 1909, the pattern is complete, and it has been demonstrated in every era. Sail, caution, and losses anyway. Steam, confidence, schedules, and losses at higher speed. The fog is permanent. The shoals are badly charted. The surf is a one-way valve that delivers people onto a shore that cannot support them. The land grows out and swallows the evidence, and the whole system is powered by a current that nobody can turn off, because that current is also the reason anyone is here. You might reasonably expect the 20th century to fix this. It had radio. It had better charts. It had aircraft, engines, motor vehicles, and eventually radar. What actually happened is that the 20th century introduced a new kind of pressure that pushed ships closer to this coast than any commercial schedule ever had, and did it deliberately, as policy, with full knowledge of the risk. The pressure was a submarine. In the Second World War, the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope became the artery of the British war effort in North Africa and the Middle East. With the Mediterranean effectively closed to through traffic for long periods, everything going to the Eighth Army, ammunition, vehicles, fuel, aircraft parts, men, went the long way, down the Atlantic, around the Cape, up the East African coast to Suez. It was a voyage of many weeks, and the ships doing it were often fast enough to be sailed independently rather than in convoy, on the theory that speed and unpredictability were better protection than a slow-moving group that a U-boat could not miss. German submarines followed the traffic south. By 1942, they were operating off West Africa in numbers, and in October of that year, the Cape itself was attacked, with heavy sinkings off the South African coast. The threat was real, current, and understood by every master on the route. The counter-tactic was to hug the coast. The reasoning is sound, and it is worth spelling out because it is going to kill a ship. A submarine attacking a coastal ship has to come in close, into shallow water, where its escape options disappear and where it can be seen from shore and from the air. Deep water is where a U-boat wants to work. Shallow water is where it is at risk. So a merchant master running alone, unescorted at night without lights, would tuck in against the land, sometimes within a few miles of a shore he could not see. Because being close to the beach made him a harder and less attractive target. Look at what that decision does to the risk profile. It reduces the probability of one hazard, torpedoing, which is catastrophic and unpredictable. It increases the probability of another, grounding, which on most coasts is embarrassing and survivable. On this coast, it is neither, and it does something else. It puts a blacked-out ship, running at speed, on a moonless night with no lights showing and no lights ashore, inside the position uncertainty of a badly charted reef, named after the last ship it destroyed. On the night of the 29th of November, 1942, that is exactly where the Dunedin Star was. She was a Blue Star Line motor vessel, fast, refrigerated, built for the meat trade between Britain and the Southern Hemisphere, and requisitioned into the war effort like everything else that could carry weight at speed. Her master was Captain R.B. Lee. She had 85 crew and 21 passengers, and the passengers are the detail that changes the temperature of this whole story. They were civilians getting out of Britain, women and elderly men, some with infants, leaving a country under bombing for destinations in Africa and the Middle East. She was carrying munitions and supplies for the Allied forces in the Middle East, routed from Liverpool for Saldanha Bay, then Aden, then Egypt. Just before midnight on Sunday, the 29th of November, running the coast in the dark, she struck something submerged. The consensus is that it was the Clan Alpine Shoal, the reef named for the ship it killed in 1890, the one the Admiralty could not place precisely. Sources also differ on exactly how far south of the Kunene mouth the impact happened. You will see figures ranging from a few miles to around 40 kilometers, and there is no reason to pretend to a precision the record does not support. What is not in doubt is that she was holed, that water came in fast, and that Captain Lee had about 10 minutes to make the decision that defines the rest of the incident. He had two choices: stay in deep water and try to control the flooding, with 106 people aboard a ship that might go down under them in the dark, on a coast with no rescue service and no other ship in sight, or drive her at the beach and put her on the sand where she could not sink. He drove her at the beach. That was the right call. It is important to say so plainly, because everything that follows is grim, and there is a temptation to look backward for a mistake. There was no mistake in that decision. A grounded ship is a platform. A sinking ship is a hole in the water. He beached her, and she came to rest roughly 500 yards off the shore, upright, held on the sand, with her people alive and her radio working. Under any reasonable reading of the situation, the emergency was over. They were on a beach. All they had to do was get to it. That is the moment the coast starts collecting. The ship's motorboat was launched and began ferrying people ashore through the surf. It went the way the surf goes, which is landward, and it worked. 63 people were put on that beach, including the women and the children, over a series of trips. And then the swell got at the boat. Accounts vary in the detail. What is agreed is that the motorboat was disabled and could not continue, which left 43 people still aboard the wreck and 63 on the sand, with no means of moving anyone between the two, and no means of getting anyone off the beach. Stop and look at the geometry, because it is grotesque. 500 yards, less than half a kilometer. The people on the beach could see the ship. The people on the ship could see the beach and could see the camp and could watch what happened there. Between them lay a distance a competent swimmer covers in 10 minutes in a swimming pool and cannot cross at all in Benguela surf. The ship had food and water aboard. The beach had neither. And the water was going the wrong way for anyone to do anything about it. The 63 built a camp in the dunes above the tide line. They dragged the sails out of an abandoned lifeboat and rigged them as shelter for the women and children, because shade was the first problem, and it was going to be the problem every day. Somebody had had the sense to land water and provisions, but the quantity was small and the arithmetic was immediately hostile. 63 people in a desert, with fog every night and no rain ever, and a daily water requirement in that heat that is not a matter of comfort. In direct sun on that coast, a person loses liters a day through sweat and breath alone. Rationing does not solve that. Rationing only decides how fast you decline. What they had instead of water was a radio and a war. The Dunedin Star's distress signal went out and was heard, and this is where the modern part of the story begins. Because in 1533 or 1909, the story would already be finished. In 1942, there was a machine to respond. South Africa was a belligerent power with naval and air forces, and Walvis Bay, the only usable port on the whole coast, was the base from which anything at all could be sent. A response was authorized quickly, but authorization is not arrival, and this is the point where distance stops being a number on a chart and becomes the central character. From Walvis Bay to the wreck site is the better part of 500 kilometers of open coast. A tug making 10 or 11 knots takes 2 days. From Cape Town, where the South African Air Force had aircraft that could reach the area, it is well over 1,000 kilometers by air. inside the range of a twin-engine bomber, but not by a comfortable margin, and over terrain where a forced landing is its own emergency. From Windhoek, the territorial capital, and the nearest place with vehicles, fuel, and men, the wreck is roughly 600 kilometers away with no road for most of it. Not a bad road. No road. Gravel plain, dune fields, dry riverbeds with soft sand in the bottom and salt pans. Every one of those routes was used. Every one of them cost something. The sea response came first. The British cargo ship Manchester Division came up, and the Norwegian merchantman Temeraire, and the South African naval minesweeper HMSS Nareen, and from Walvis Bay, the tug Sir Charles Elliot. On paper, that is a substantial force, 4 vessels converging on a grounded ship 500 yards offshore. On the water, it meant almost nothing, and understanding why is the key to this entire coast. A ship standing off a lee shore in swell cannot approach a stranded vessel that is inside the break. If she comes in far enough to be useful, she becomes a casualty herself, because the same shoaling bottom that caught the Dunedin Star is under her too, and the same surf that pins one hull will pin another. So the rescue ships lay off in deep water and did the only thing available. They sent boats, small boats, pulled or under a small motor, into a heavy Benguela swell, toward a beach with no landing place, and then tried to bring them back out again. That last part is the impossible one. Going in is a matter of surviving the ride. Coming out means punching a boat through a break, wave after wave, each of which stops her dead and pushes her back, and each of which will fill her or turn her over if it catches her at an angle. This is why the 63 on the beach stayed on the beach. It was not for want of ships. There were ships within sight. It was because the last 400 meters between the water and the sand only works in one direction, and no amount of tonnage lying offshore changes that. They tried a line. If you cannot bring a boat back out through the surf, you can sometimes rig a line between ship and shore and haul people through the water on it. A breeches buoy, in effect. And the standard way to get the first line ashore is to fire it from a rocket. The rocket line failed. The Nareen's radio operator, a man named Dennis Scully, tied a rope around his body and swam it in himself. Think about what that involves. Cold water. The Benguela is in the teens, cold enough that a man's grip and coordination start to go inside half an hour. A heavy line dragging behind you, getting heavier as it takes up water, and pulling you backward every time the boat astern of you moves. A break to get through. And once you are on the sand, you are on the wrong side of the valve, in a desert, with the rest of them, and the only way back is the way you came. Over the following 2 days, the Nareen's boat crew, working the line and the surf, took 22 people off that beach, including 2 women and 2 babies. 22 out of 63 in 2 days of work, with a warship standing off and a man who had swum a line through the surf to make it possible. That is what the state-of-the-art in 1942 could achieve against 400 meters of breaking water. The 43 still aboard the wreck were taken off by the boats of the vessel standing by. The accounts differ over the exact allocation. The tug Sir Charles Elliot is credited with taking a large group, the Temeraire with picking up others. And it does not much matter because the outcome was the same. Everyone who had stayed on the ship got out of it, leaving a fact that ought to be uncomfortable and somehow never quite is. The safest place to be in the whole disaster was the wreck. The people who never left the Dunedin Star were taken off by boat to ships that then sailed away. The people who reached the shore, the ones who had appeared to escape, who had made it through the surf on the first night, who had every reason to think themselves the lucky ones, were still sitting on that sand when the tug that came to help them was wrecked, and still there for days after that. And by then the rescue itself had started to come apart. The tug Sir Charles Elliot had come up from Walvis Bay, and reached the wreck on the 2nd of December. She did what she could. She was a salvage tug, and a salvage tug on a coast with no salvage tugs is a genuinely valuable thing. And on the 3rd of December, she turned south for home. At about 6 the next morning, she went aground herself just north of Rocky Point. The same coast, the same current, the same uncertain charts, on a shoreline that had shifted since anyone last looked at it. A vessel whose entire professional purpose was pulling other ships off the ground put herself on it, roughly 100 kilometers from the ship she had come to help, in the dark, on a passage her crew had every reason to consider routine. Her people then had to get ashore, and here the coast collected its first bodies of the operation. They put a dinghy over. The hooks on the falls, the fittings that hold a small boat while it is being lowered down a ship's side, failed as the boat went down, and the men in it were tipped into the water. One of them drowned. Another made it into the surf and swam for the beach and reached it and died afterward, exhausted, having done the hardest thing a person can do in that water and having done it successfully. Their names were Angus McIntyre and Matthias Koraseb. Koraseb's grave is still at Rocky Point. The other man's body was never recovered. 2 men dead. Not from the Dunedin Star. From the attempt to help her. Hold that for a second, because it is the structural fact of this entire coast, and it has now shown itself in a form nobody can argue with. The ship that hit the reef with 106 people aboard lost nobody. The tug that came to assist lost 2. The danger here is not concentrated in the moment of impact. It is distributed across the whole operation of being on this coast at all, and it lands hardest on the people who arrive by choice. The tug's surviving crew were now on the beach as well, which meant the rescue had just increased the number of people requiring rescue. The air response was the newest tool available and, in principle, the answer to everything. Aircraft do not care about surf, they do not care about sandbars, lee shores, or the absence of harbors. They cross 500 kilometers of hostile coast in 2 hours instead of 2 days. 3 Venturas of the South African Air Force flew supply drops to the beach camp from the 3rd of December, which mattered enormously. Dropped stores are how the camp stayed alive, although anyone who has watched a supply drop knows the arithmetic there too. A significant fraction of what you drop bursts, buries itself, or lands where nobody can reach it, and water is the worst thing to drop because water containers do not survive impact well, and water is the thing you most need. Because you should understand what the camp actually was in physical terms for those weeks. 60-odd people, then 41 after the Nareen's boat took 22 of them, living in the dunes above a beach with a shelter made from lifeboat sails. No structure, no firewood. There is nothing to burn on that shore. 2 problems running against each other on a 12-hour cycle: heat and glare through the day, with sand that is painful to sit on and light coming off it hard enough to damage eyes. And then the night, when the fog rolls in off the Benguela and the temperature drops sharply and everything and everyone gets wet. Sleeping is difficult in the heat and difficult in the cold. There is no way to get dry. The water was rationed, and the rationing did not solve the arithmetic. It only slowed it. What sustained the camp was the drops, and drops arrive on a schedule set by aircraft availability, flying conditions, and fuel, not by need. Between them, people waited. Some of the party were elderly. Some were women with infants, and an infant in that environment dehydrates faster than an adult and cannot be reasoned with about rationing. And the whole time, 500 yards out, there was a ship. Day after day of that meant watching aircraft come over and go away again, and watching ships stand off in deep water and do nothing, because nothing was what they could do. Then somebody decided to try landing. Look at the map through a pilot's eyes, and you can see the temptation. There is no airfield anywhere on this coast, and there is no need for one, Because the coastal plain is covered with salt pans, flat, hard-looking, dead level, kilometers across. Apparently the most natural runway in the world. A pan is a place where water collected and evaporated, leaving a crust of salt and clay. And a dry pan can be as hard as concrete. It can also be a lid. It is the same trick the coast plays with everything else. The surface you can see is not the material underneath. Wind blows sand across a pan and covers it, so what you look at from 1,000 feet is a smooth, uniform, inviting plain. Underneath the crust, moisture can persist. Brine drawn up from below, fog condensing and soaking in year after year. And where it does, the material beneath sets up as something with the consistency of wet clay. The crust bridges it. It will carry a person. It may carry a light vehicle. Put a twin-engined bomber on it, and the wheels go through, and the aircraft settles onto its belly in ground that behaves like glue. On the 6th of December, Captain Emmons Naud put a Ventura down on a sand-covered pan near the wreck site. The crust broke. The aircraft bogged. What followed is one of the more remarkable pieces of manual labor in the history of air rescue. The crew, and people from the beach, dug an aircraft weighing several tons out of a salt pan by hand, in that heat, over roughly 4 days, without machinery, without a tow, and without any prospect of anyone else coming to do it for them. They got it out. They got it moving. They got it into the air. 43 minutes later, the engines gave trouble and the aircraft went into the sea. The crew got out. They floated ashore through the surf, one-way valve working exactly as designed. And then they walked. Accounts differ over how many survivors the Venturas managed to lift out of the area before that aircraft was lost, and the honest position is that the detail is contested. What is not contested is the outcome. The air arm of the rescue had now expended 1 aircraft, and its crew had joined the population of people standing on a beach in the Namib, waiting for somebody to arrive overland, which is what the last option was. A convoy had left Windhoek under Captain J.W.B. Smith of the Southwest Africa Police. Most accounts give it 11 vehicles, some say 8. It was tasked with driving to a wreck on a coast that had no road to it, across roughly 600 kilometers of country that had never had a vehicle on most of it, in December, which in that part of the world is high summer. Consider what that drive actually consists of. You leave the highlands and drop into the gravel plains. And the gravel plains are the good part, hard, flat, fast, and hard on tires. Then you meet the riverbeds. An ephemeral river in the Namib is a channel of deep, dry, unconsolidated sand, sometimes hundreds of meters wide, and a loaded truck of the 1940s crossing one has a straightforward problem. It stops. Momentum is everything. Tire pressures are everything. And the moment a wheel digs in, you are unloading the vehicle, laying whatever you have under the wheels and pushing. That is an hour. Sometimes it is a day. Then there are dune fields, which have to be gone around. And going around means adding distance in a place where fuel is finite, and all of it is on the trucks. And then there are the pans, which will do to a truck exactly what one did to the Ventura, and which cannot be avoided because they are frequently the only flat ground going the right way. The convoy bogged repeatedly. It got there anyway. Smith's vehicles reached the wreck site on the 8th of December, 9 days after the ship struck. 9 days. That is the number that tells you what this coast is. Not because anyone was slow, a police officer put 11 trucks across 600 kilometers of trackless desert in 9 days in 1942. And that is a serious piece of work. 9 days because the place is 9 days wide and no amount of urgency compresses it. Then everybody had to drive back out, which was the same journey in reverse with a load of exhausted, dehydrated civilians aboard. And it took longer. Smith's trucks reached Windhoek on the 23rd of December. Survivors continued from there by train. Captain Naud, whose aircraft was in the sea, came out with the convoy. And that is how it ended. Except that it did not end there either. Efforts around the wreck, salvage attempts, the recovery of what could be recovered, the closing out of an operation strung across 500 kilometers of coastline ran on into the new year, and the whole affair is generally reckoned to have finished on the 1st of February 1943. The final accounting is the strangest thing about it. Every one of the 106 people aboard the Dunedin Star survived, all 85 crew, all 21 passengers, including the women and the infants. Not one of them died. The rescue killed 2 men, destroyed a tug, destroyed an aircraft, and consumed the better part of 2 months and the resources of a naval force, an air force, and a police force in the middle of a world war. That is the reversal this coast is built on, and it has a postscript that makes it sharper than any statistic. In 1944, a South African journalist named John Henry Marsh published a book about the incident. He called it Skeleton Coast. The name stuck so completely that it went onto maps and stayed there. And it is now the standard designation for this entire stretch of shoreline on charts, in atlases and in Namibian law. So the most famous dangerous coastline in Africa is named after a book about a shipwreck in which nobody on the ship died. Not one person. The name that conjures bones on a beach comes from an event whose defining characteristic was total survival. And the 2 men who did die were rescuers, on a different vessel, 100 kilometers away, doing a job they had volunteered for. If you wanted a single object that explains what this place actually does to people, it would be hard to improve on that. There is an aftermath, and it says something uncomfortable about how organizations respond to this kind of event. Captain Lee was dismissed by the Blue Star Line. He had lost the ship. That is, in the end, the thing a shipping company cannot forgive, and the company was within its rights. A master is responsible for his vessel, and the vessel was on a beach in Namibia with munitions in her holds. But look at the ledger. He was running an unescorted ship through waters where submarines were sinking merchantmen, on the tactically recommended track close inshore, at night, blacked out, in a war, and he struck a hazard whose charted position his own admiralty could not guarantee. When she started flooding, he made the one decision available that guaranteed nobody drowned that night, and nobody did. 106 people went home. He went back to sea. He commanded a vessel on D-Day, and afterward retired to India, where he died not long after. I raise it because it is the earliest example on this coast of a pattern that has repeated ever since. When a ship is lost here, the investigation looks at the bridge. It looks at the master, the watchkeeper, the course, the speed, the decision. It very rarely looks at the fact that a hazard was on a chart with an acknowledged uncertainty about where it actually was, or that there was no port of refuge within 500 kilometers, or that the tactical guidance that put the ship close inshore came from somebody else entirely. The bridge is where the accountability is easy to assign. The system is where the danger lives. The obvious question is whether any of this was fixable, and the honest answer is that most of it was. Look at the failure points. The ship hit a reef whose position was uncertain, fixable with better survey, and, eventually, with satellite navigation. She could not be reached from shore, fixable with helicopters. She could not tell anyone precisely where she was, fixable with radio direction finding, then radar, then GPS. The tug grounded on a badly charted coast at night, fixable. The aircraft broke through a salt pan because nobody could tell from the air what was under the crust, fixable. In the sense that you stop landing on pans and start using rotary wing aircraft that do not need to. All of it was fixed. Every single one of those problems was solved, thoroughly, by the second half of the 20th century. The wrecks kept coming. Radar came out of the war and onto merchant ships within a decade. And on paper, it is the perfect answer to a fog-bound coastline. It sees through fog. It does not care about darkness. It gives you range and bearing to solid objects, which is exactly what a navigator lacks when the visibility closes down. Put a 1950s radar set on a ship approaching the Skeleton Coast and watch what it actually gives you. It gives you a line. A faint, ragged line across the top of the display, which is the coast, which is Sakikma, which is Takalfituide, and which looks identical to the coast 100 kilometers north and the coast 100 kilometers south. There is no headland to identify, no island, no cliff, no peak, no river mouth wide enough to show. Radar answers the question, is there land ahead and how far away is it? And on this coast, that was never the question. The question is, which part of 500 kilometers of identical land is this? And radar cannot answer that at all, because the answer requires a feature, and the coast declines to provide one. There is a second problem, and it is physical. Radar energy hitting a low, flat, sandy shore at a shallow angle mostly bounces away from you rather than back at you. Sand is a poor reflector. A beach that rises 2 meters over 300 horizontal meters presents almost nothing to reflect. So the return is weak, and it competes with sea clutter, the noise thrown back by the surface of the water, which is at its worst precisely where the waves are breaking, which is precisely where the danger is. The most dangerous 400 meters on this coast is the part radar sees least well. So the fog kept working. In 1955, the cargo ship Natal Coast, 3,000 tons, ran aground north of Swakopmund in thick fog, carrying coconuts from the Congo to Cape Town. Coconuts. There is something bleakly funny about that cargo on that shore, and something instructive too. This was not a war emergency or a diamond rush or a fishing gamble. It was an ordinary commercial voyage carrying ordinary commercial cargo, doing the same thing on the same coast that had been killing ships for 4 centuries, with a mid-20th century bridge and mid-20th century equipment, and the fog put her on the beach anyway. The shore itself, in these same decades, had become an industrial site in its own right, which put people and machinery permanently in the trap. This coast has diamonds. They came down the Orange River over millions of years, were dumped into the Atlantic, and were then moved north by the same longshore drift that buries the wrecks, concentrating in beach terraces and gravel pockets along hundreds of kilometers of shoreline. The southern deposits around Oranjemund are the famous ones and remain some of the richest in the world. Further north, prospectors worked smaller and more marginal ground, and one such operation was at Toscanini, on the Skeleton Coast itself, a mining camp on a shoreline with no water, no port, no road worth the name, and nothing to recommend it except what was in the gravel, which tells you something about human motive that no amount of describing the danger does. The place is uninhabitable, and people lived there anyway, because the ground paid. Mining camps meant supply runs. Supply runs meant vessels working close inshore. And it meant that when something went wrong, there was occasionally a camp within reach. Which is the only reason the next story has survivors at all. On the 12th of November 1966, a vessel named the Viente e Oito de Mayo was running south along this coast from Cabinda, in Angola, bound for Cape Town. Her cargo was timber, around 200 cubic meters of logs, and 700 tons of railway sleepers. That is a working cargo on a working ship, not glamorous, not urgent in any strategic sense, just the ordinary business of moving heavy, low-value goods down a coast, because moving them by sea is cheaper than any alternative. Timber and sleepers also mean a lot of deck cargo, and deck cargo changes a ship's behavior. It raises the center of gravity, it complicates access, and it makes the working areas of the deck harder to cross in a hurry. She went off course. The record says no more than that about the cause, and there is every reason to resist the urge to fill the gap. What we know is that a ship on a southbound coastal passage ended up 3 kilometers north of the Toscanini mine, on the beach, instead of some tens of kilometers offshore where she should have been. The mechanism that produces that error on this coast has not changed since 1909. An unlit, featureless shore, a current that sets you toward it, and a radar picture that cannot tell you which part of the coast you are looking at. She grounded. And then the crew did the correct thing, by the book, in the way every seaman is trained to do it, and the book killed 3 of them. They went to the boats. Understand why. A ship aground in surf is being worked by the sea. She grinds, she pounds, she can break her back. And the standard response to a vessel that may not survive is to get the people off her and into boats. That is not panic. It is procedure. And it is right almost everywhere in the world. 12 men got into a lifeboat, and it was lowered toward the water. A lifeboat comes down on davits, the curved arms that swing the boat outboard, through a set of falls and releasing gear, and the whole system is holding several tons of boat and men above a moving sea. As the boat neared the water, one of the davits broke. 12 men went into the surf. 3 of them drowned. Those are the most important 20 seconds in this entire story, because of where they happened. Not in the ocean, not in a gale in the open Atlantic. In the surf zone, alongside a ship that was aground in shallow water, within sight of a beach, a few kilometers from a mining camp with people in it. The last 30 meters, the width of the break itself, is what kills on this coast, not the crossing, not the storm. The strip of white water between a hull and the sand, and it kills for reasons that are purely mechanical. Water moving in a breaking wave is not water flowing past you. It is water tumbling, with several tons of it in each cubic meter of the churn, and it will hold a person under for the duration of the break, whether or not he can swim. Under a grounded ship's side, there is also the backwash. The water that came up the beach, draining back out along the bottom, fast, in a place where the incoming wave is coming over the top of you. And there is the ship herself, a steel wall moving a meter or 2 on every swell, with a hull that will not stop for a body between it and the sand. Then the new tool arrived, and it worked. A helicopter came from Windhoek and lifted the rest of the crew off the vessel and put them down at the mine. Look carefully at what that changed and what it did not. A helicopter does not need a harbor. It does not need a beach, a road, a pan, a boat, or a line through the surf. It does not need the sea to cooperate at all. It hovers over the deck of a grounded ship and takes people off it vertically, 1 or 2 at a time. And it puts them somewhere safe, and it does the whole thing in the time it takes a lifeboat to be swung out. In 1942, an aircraft on this coast was a liability that had to be dug out of a salt pan by hand and then crashed into the sea. In 1966, an aircraft on this coast was the single most effective rescue asset available, and it has been ever since. But notice what the helicopter did not do. It did not arrive before the davit broke. It came from Windhoek, 600-odd kilometers inland, after the ship was already aground, and the emergency was already running. The 3 men who drowned died in the first minutes, using the ship's own equipment, while the effective rescue asset was still on the ground in a different part of the country. That gap, between the moment options disappear and the moment help physically arrives, is the thing this coast has never given up. Technology has attacked it from every direction for 80 years. It has shrunk it enormously. It has never closed it because the gap is made of distance, and distance is the one variable no equipment has ever changed. And here is the thing that ought to have been obvious from the start and somehow never is. Every single mechanism that makes this coast lethal is a product of the Bengala Current. The cold water makes the fog. The upwelling makes the cold water. The wind that drives the upwelling drives the swell that makes the surf. The current sets ships north and confuses their dead reckoning. The same water column that sucks the heat out of a swimmer in 20 minutes is the reason there is no rain. And the reason there is no rain is the reason there is no fresh water on the shore, and the absence of fresh water is what turns a survived grounding into a survival emergency. The Benguela is the whole machine. It is also the reason anyone is out there. Upwelling systems are the food factories of the ocean. There are only a handful of major ones in the world. Off Peru, off California, off Northwest Africa, and here. And they work because the wind keeps dragging deep, nutrient-loaded water into the sunlit layer, where phytoplankton can use it. Everything else follows from that: plankton, then sardine and anchovy and horse mackerel, then hake, then seals and seabirds in colonies of hundreds of thousands, then the fishing fleets. The Benguela system supports one of the most productive fisheries in the Atlantic, and Namibia's economy is built on it. Fishing is among the country's largest export earners after mining. Hake is the money fish, filleted in Walvis Bay for the American and Japanese markets, and the processing roughly doubles the value of the catch and employs a great many people who live in a coastal town with very little else. Horse mackerel is the volume fish. Pilchard was, until the stock was fished down and the fishery essentially closed. There are quotas, total allowable catches set annually, species by species, and quota is the most powerful behavioral force in any fishery on Earth. Quota is a deadline. That is the part people outside the industry miss. A quota does not merely limit how much you can take. It converts fishing into a race against a clock and against everyone else holding a license. You have a boat with a crew that must be paid, fuel that must be burned, an owner with a loan, a processing plant onshore waiting for fish, and a season that ends. Weather that would keep a yacht in harbor does not keep a trawler in harbor, because a day alongside is a day of costs with no catch against it. So the boats go, and they go to where the fish are, and the fish are exactly where the upwelling is strongest, which is close inshore along the most harborless coast in the South Atlantic. It is the reversal that reframes everything after 1950. Before that, ships were on this coast because they had to pass it. After that, they are on it because they want to be. The traffic stopped being through traffic. It became working traffic, vessels deliberately operating in the danger zone, at night, in fog, at low speed with gear in the water, sometimes for weeks at a stretch, because that is where the money is. You cannot fish from a safe distance. The current has one more habit that almost nobody outside the region has heard of, and it shows how strange this system really is. The Benguela's productivity is so extreme that not all of it gets eaten. Dead plankton rains down onto the shelf faster than the ecosystem can process it, and it has been doing so for a very long time, building a belt of organic mud along the inner Namibian shelf that runs for hundreds of kilometers in water less than 200 meters deep. Bacteria in that mud decompose the material without oxygen, and the byproducts are methane and hydrogen sulfide. The gas accumulates. Then, periodically, it comes up, bubbling out of the sediment, stripping oxygen from the water column as it rises, and surfacing in plumes large enough to be photographed from orbit as turquoise stains kilometers across. The result is a stretch of sea that occasionally poisons itself. Fish die in numbers. Seals move out. The coast smells of rotten eggs for days. It is a documented, recurring, entirely natural phenomenon. And on this scale, it is not known to happen anywhere else in the world. I mention it because of what it does to your mental model. This is not a coast where a rich, benign ocean happens to sit next to a hostile desert. The ocean and the desert are the same system, driven by the same wind and the same current. And the system's productivity and its lethality are not in tension. They are the same property, seen from two directions. The water that feeds Walvis Bay is the water that made the fog that put the Edouard Bolin in the sand. Which brings us to what happened when that fleet started meeting this coast at scale. In 1973, the fishing trawler Montrose was lost near Tora Bay in poor weather, and the coast did what it does. She was gradually covered by sand, not salvaged, not broken up, not towed off, buried in place, at the rate the shoreline builds. In June 1976, the South African fishing vessel SW Seal caught fire north of the Ugab Gate and was lost. Fire deserves a moment on its own because it is the one emergency where this coast is genuinely worse than open ocean, and the reason is counterintuitive. Fire on a fishing vessel is common. They carry fuel, they carry lubricants, they carry refrigeration plant, they run engines and generators hard for long periods, and their accommodation is small, timber-lined in older boats and packed with gear. The standard response is to fight it, and if you cannot fight it, to abandon into boats or rafts and wait for another vessel to pick you up. In open water, on a working fishing ground, that usually means another boat is within an hour or two, because fishing fleets cluster. Close to this shore, the calculation changes. A burning vessel drifting toward the Skeleton Coast is drifting toward a lee shore and surf, which means the boats and rafts you abandon into will be carried through the break onto the beach. And the beach is the desert, and a vessel on fire cannot use her own engines to hold off. She loses power. And once she loses power, the swell decides where she goes. And the swell here has exactly one destination. Fire removes propulsion. No propulsion on a lee shore removes everything else. So by the mid-1970s, a person keeping track of this coast could have written down the complete list of ways it takes ships, and every mechanism on that list had been demonstrated repeatedly across 400 years. Fog and dead reckoning. Uncharted or poorly charted shoals. A current that biases navigation error toward the land. A featureless shore that defeats visual and radar identification. Surf that pins a hull and passes people one way. A hinterland with no water. A rescue distance measured in days. And a shoreline that grows out over the evidence. Everybody in the industry knew it. The wrecks were sitting there in plain sight, some of them visible from the air, some of them close enough to the road south of the park to be photographed by tourists. And then, in the middle of that decade, somebody built the most modern fishing vessel on the coast, filled her with the best navigational equipment money could buy, sent her out on her first voyage, and put her on the rocks. The Zuiderkus was a factory trawler built for the Angra Pequena Viscorporatie of Cape Town. She cost 3.5 million rand at mid-1970s prices, which made her one of the most expensive fishing vessels on the coast, and the money did not go into decoration. A factory trawler is a processing plant with a hull around it. She catches, guts, fillets, and freezes at sea, which means she can stay out for weeks instead of days, and can work grounds too far from port for a boat that has to run her catch home fresh. Everything about that design is aimed at extending range and endurance. She was fitted with the most sophisticated navigational equipment available. Every account of her repeats that detail, and it gets repeated because of what happened next. On her maiden voyage, the very first working trip of a brand new vessel, with the best instruments on the coast, she went onto the rocks at Moa Bay. Sources give the date as December 1976. Others give the 16th of January, 1977. Either way, it was her first voyage. Moa Bay is not a bay in any useful sense. It is a slight indentation on the Skeleton Coast about halfway up the park with a ranger station and nothing else, and rocks. She struck them, and she stayed on them, and afterward, in one of the coast's characteristic squalls, the sea picked her hull up and threw it high onto the beach, above the working tide line, out of reach of the water that had wrecked her. Most of her disintegrated within months. A large section of hull is still there, and cormorants live on it. The accessible accounts of the wreck do not record any loss of life among her crew. What the coast took was the ship, a brand new vessel, 3.5 million rand, on the rocks before she had completed a single commercial voyage. Now why? The lazy answer is that somebody was incompetent, and the lazy answer is almost never right in maritime casualties. The useful answer is a mechanism, and this one is general enough that it explains groundings on coastlines that have nothing else in common. Better instruments raise confidence faster than they raise margin. Follow the logic. Before you have accurate positioning, you plan your track with a large allowance for error. You do not know where you are to better than a few miles, so you stay several miles further off than you need to, and that extra distance is a buffer you never think about because you never use it. Then you get equipment that fixes your position accurately. Now you know where you are, so the rational thing, and the thing every operator does in every industry, is to reduce the allowance. You plan a closer track because a closer track is shorter, cheaper, and, on a fishing vessel, closer to the fish. Accuracy does not automatically become safety, it becomes proximity. The safety only appears if you deliberately keep the old margin, and nobody keeps the old margin, because keeping it means paying for a buffer you can now prove you do not need. And the buffer was never really about position error alone. It was also absorbing everything else. A chart that is wrong, a shoal that has moved, an autopilot holding a course while a set pushes the ship sideways, a watchkeeper who has been awake too long, an instrument that has quietly failed while still displaying numbers. A confident position takes away the fear that used to make people leave room for those things, and it takes it away without removing any of the things themselves. That is the Swederkus in a sentence. The best equipped vessel on the coast, on a shore where the rocks are badly surveyed and the current sets you toward them, ended up closer in than a poorly equipped vessel would have dared to go. The same mechanism runs through everything that has happened here since. It ran through the war, when a ship hugged the coast, because that was the tactically correct thing to do. It ran through the 1909 steamer, holding her speed in fog, because her engines were reliable. It runs through modern electronic charts, where a vessel's own symbol sits on the display like a fact rather than an estimate, and where the chart underneath that symbol may be built on surveys nobody has repeated in decades. Every genuine improvement in capability gets spent. Some of it gets spent on safety. Most of it gets spent on doing more with the same risk. And every so often, this coast reminds everyone that it does not require a navigational error at all. There is a wind here that runs the wrong way. Most of the year, the air moves onshore, cool, damp, off the Benguela, carrying the fog inland. Then, mainly in the southern winter, high pressure over the interior plateau sends air the other way, down off the escarpment, out over the desert, and out to sea. Air descending from an altitude of over 1,000 meters compresses and heats as it falls, and it arrives on the coast dry, dusty, and startlingly hot. These are the berg winds, mountain winds. And they can take a coastal town from a foggy 15 degrees to well over 30 in a matter of hours, fill the air with sand, and blow hard enough to be a hazard in their own right. They are also offshore. That matters enormously to a moored vessel, because a mooring in Walvis Bay is arranged with the normal weather in mind, and the normal weather comes from the sea. In 2006, a hake trawler called the Kolmanskop was lying at a mooring buoy inside the port limits at Walvis Bay, when gusts recorded at around 50 knots tore her loose. She was not underway. She had no watch fighting a storm, no navigational decision to get wrong, no fog, no reef. She was tied up in the only sheltered harbor on the entire coast. She drifted north and went ashore near Virkant Klip, south of Swakopmund. The distance is reported differently in different accounts. Some say she was driven around 20 kilometers from her mooring. A contemporary casualty report says roughly 40. And the discrepancy is itself typical of how this coast is documented. What is agreed is that a vessel at a mooring inside a working port ended up wedged among rocks on an open beach, and the salvage effort that followed was concerned mainly with getting the pollutants out of her before the surf finished the job. Read that alongside everything else, and it lands differently. We have spent 400 years watching ships be driven onto this shore by fog, by current, by bad charts, by war, by quota pressure, and by misplaced confidence. And then a wind out of the desert takes one off a buoy in the harbor and puts her on the beach anyway, without any of it. The coast does not need you to make a mistake. It only needs you to be there. One assumption has been sitting underneath everything so far, and it deserves to be examined because it is the assumption most people make about a place like this, that the machine is fixed, that the current runs, the fog forms, the swell arrives, and it has always been that way and always will be. It is not that stable, and the instability cuts in an unexpected direction. Every few years, the northern part of this system does something abnormal. Warm tropical water pushes down the coast from Angola and displaces the cold upwelled water along the Namibian shelf. Oceanographers call these events Benguela Niños, by analogy with the Pacific phenomenon, and the strongest in recent decades was in the early months of 1995, when sea surface temperatures off Angola and Namibia ran around 2 degrees above normal on average and up to 4 degrees warmer in places. 2 degrees does not sound like much. In an upwelling system, it is enormous. The whole structure depends on a sharp contrast between cold, nutrient-rich water below and warm, nutrient-poor water above. Warm the surface layer and you cap it, and the nutrients stop reaching the light. Productivity falls. Fish move or die. The 1995 event, following a low oxygen episode the previous year, coincided with the lowest sardine stock levels on record. Warm intrusions displace stocks, drive mass mortalities, and rearrange the fishery for years afterward. They also change the fog. Recent work on fog variability along this coast has been trying to pin down exactly what drives the year-to-year differences and the emerging picture points at the strength of coastal upwelling and at these tropical warm water intrusions as key controls, consistent with fog here forming by advection, air chilled from below as it crosses cold water, which means the logic runs straight through: warm the shelf water, and the air crossing it is chilled less, and the marine layer is less likely to saturate, and there is less fog. So a warm event on this coast makes it clearer. That sounds like good news, and it is not. And this is the part I want to be careful about, because it would be easy to overclaim. There is no study I can point you to that establishes a causal link between Benguela Niños and shipping casualties. Nobody has run that analysis, as far as I can find, and I am not going to invent a finding to make the story tidier. What can be said is what the mechanism implies, and the mechanism is not subtle. A warm event does two things at once. It makes the coast look safer because the fog thins, and it makes the fleet more desperate because the fish are gone from where they were, and the quota still has to be caught, and the boat still has to be paid for. Better visibility and a harder search at the same time, on the same coastline, in the same season. A fleet that goes further, works longer, and takes chances it would not take in a good year, on a shore where the surf and the sandbars and the rock have not changed by a single centimeter, because none of those depend on water temperature. That is the honest version of the climate question here, and it applies to the longer-term picture too. The projections for eastern boundary upwelling systems under a warming world are genuinely contested. There are arguments that intensified pressure gradients strengthen the alongshore winds and increase upwelling, and arguments that a more stratified ocean weakens the whole system, and the modeling does not agree. Namibia's own fisheries risk assessments treat the uncertainty itself as the problem, but notice which parts of this coast's danger are actually temperature dependent and which are not. The fog is temperature dependent. It could thin or thicken or shift its season. The swell is not. It is generated thousands of kilometers south by the Southern Ocean storm track and arrives here regardless. The absence of harbors is not. The absence of fresh water is not. The sandbars are not. The distance from Walvis Bay to the Cunene is not. Change the climate however you like, and 5 of the 6 components of this machine sit exactly where they are. The one variable that can move is the one that determines whether you see the shore coming. And the historical record on this coast is unambiguous, that seeing it coming has never been the same thing as staying off it. The Edouard Bolin's officers were doing everything by the book. The Suiderkus had every instrument on the coast. The Kolmanskop was tied to a buoy inside the harbor, which leaves one more question worth asking before the modern era closes this out. If the surf is the killer, and it has been the killer for 5 centuries, why has nobody put a rescue capability on the shore itself? The answer is that a rescue station needs a crew, and a crew needs to live somewhere, and there is nowhere to live. That sounds glib. It is not. A shore-based sea rescue capability, the kind that has saved tens of thousands of lives on the coasts of Britain, South Africa, Australia, and everywhere else with a serious maritime tradition, is built on a specific set of preconditions. You need a town because you need volunteers or paid crew within minutes of the boathouse. You need a launching point, a slipway, a harbor, a beach. A boat can actually be got off. You need fuel, workshops, spares, and a road to bring them in on. And you need enough call-outs to justify all of it, which in practice means recreational and commercial traffic concentrated near the station. Run down the Skeleton Coast and count how many of those preconditions exist anywhere between Henties Bay and the Angolan border. None. There is no town. The permanent human presence on that entire shoreline is a ranger station at Mua Bay and a small facility at Terrace Bay, plus whatever a fly-in concession maintains in the north. There is no slipway, and even if there were, launching a rescue boat off that beach means driving her out through the same break that stops boats coming the other way, which is the problem you built the station to solve. Water and fuel would have to be trucked hundreds of kilometers, and the call-out rate spread over 500 kilometers of coast would be a handful of incidents a decade. The rescue capability therefore lives where the people live, Walvis Bay, Windhoek, Cape Town, and it arrives by air. And the arrival time is the flight time, and the flight time is the number that has replaced the 2 days the Sir Charles Elliot took to steam up the coast in 1942. That is an enormous improvement, and it is also a hard floor. You cannot make the coast shorter, which is worth holding next to the other thing that lives out there in enormous numbers and needs nothing from anybody. At Cape Cross, on the low headland where Diogo Quinho planted his padrão in 1486, there is one of the largest breeding colonies of Cape fur seals in the world, tens of thousands of animals. In the breeding season, far more. You smell it before you see it, and you hear it from a long way off. Those seals are there for the same reason the trawlers are there, the benguela. And they are one of the few things on this coast that is genuinely, obviously, thriving. Inland from them, desert-adapted lions work the ephemeral river corridors, and researchers in the Cunene have documented them coming all the way down to the shore to hunt seals and seabirds. Elephants use the same riverbeds, moving between water points that people located generations ago. The whole biological system here is organized exactly the way the Himba organized themselves, mobile, spread thin, tied to the corridors where the water is, never staying anywhere long enough to exhaust it. Every living thing that succeeds on this coast succeeds by the same rule. Know exactly where the water is. Do not stay. The wrecks are what happens when something arrives that cannot do either. And they keep arriving, which is the part that ought to be strange and is not, because by now you can see why. The coast is not the destination. It is the thing between the destination and everywhere else. And it has to be passed by anything moving along this side of Africa, and it has to be worked by anything catching fish in the richest water on the continent. There is no version of the modern economy in which ships stop going past this shoreline, so the traffic continues, and every so often the machine takes one, and the way it takes them has stopped being about war or exploration or empire at all. By the 21st century, the ships this coast catches are not on heroic voyages. They are doing paperwork. In 2008, a trawler called the Zala was finished. Her working life was over, and she had been sold for scrap to an Indian buyer by Hangana Fishing of Walvis Bay. And the plan was the ordinary end for an old boat. Put a line on her and tow her to a breaking yard in India, where the steel is worth more than the vessel. She left Walvis Bay under tow in late August, and shortly afterward the tow line came loose. That is the entire mechanism. There was no navigational error because there was nobody navigating. There was no engine failure because there was no engine running. There was no crew aboard to make a decision because a dead ship under tow does not carry one. A steel hull with no power, no steering, and no people was suddenly loose on a coast where the swell runs on shore and the current runs north, and the outcome was determined the moment the line parted. She went ashore about 14 kilometers south of Henties Bay, at a fishing spot the locals call Die Vala, in the early hours of the 24th or 25th of August 2008. The date is given both ways in different accounts, which by now should surprise nobody. You will also find versions of the story in which she was an Angolan trawler that lost her engines and was washed ashore. The towing account is the more specific and the better sourced, and it is the one the Namibian press carried at the time. She is still there. She is one of the most photographed objects in the country, 20 minutes off the salt road north of Swakopmund, close enough that people walk down the beach at low tide to look at her. Cormorants stand on her rail. The surf goes through her frames. She is rusting in a way that is visibly faster than an equivalent hull would rust in temperate air, because the fog that rolls in off the Benguela puts a film of salt-laden moisture on every exposed surface every night, and then the sun bakes it, and the cycle repeats a few hundred times a year. That is why the wrecks on this coast look the way they do. It is not age. It is chemistry running at double speed, so a coast with no harbors has become, in the 21st century, a place people deliberately drive to. The Skeleton Coast National Park was proclaimed in 1971 and covers around 16,800 square kilometers, a strip roughly 40 kilometers deep running most of the length of the coast, protecting about a third of Namibia's shoreline. It is administered as two zones. The southern section, between the Ugab and the Hwanib, is accessible by permit through gates at the Ugab River and at Springbokwasser, with a fishing camp at Tora Bay that opens seasonally and a small settlement at Terrace Bay, where there is fuel, water, and accommodation. Beyond that, going north, the park closes. The northern section, from the Hwanib up to the Kunene, is a wilderness concession area reached essentially by air, and the only permanent presence on that shoreline is a ranger station at Mo Bay. The permits are not bureaucratic theater. They exist because the environment does not forgive independent improvisation, and because the authorities have a very clear idea of what happens to people who break down on that coast. Entry gates record who goes in. There are times by which you must have passed the far gate. There is no fuel between one settlement and the next is a long way. Water is what you carried, which produces the modern version of the oldest problem here. Imagine an ordinary bad day. A vehicle with a failed water pump, 30 kilometers north of the Ugab Gate in February, with 2 people in it. This is not a disaster. It is a mechanical failure of the kind that happens to somebody somewhere every day. On a European motorway, it is a 2-hour inconvenience. Here, the nearest fuel is at Terrace Bay, well over 100 kilometers up the coast. Mobile coverage on that shore is patchy to non-existent. The temperature on the gravel in the afternoon is a serious physiological problem, and the standing advice, stay with the vehicle, Because a vehicle is visible from the air and a person walking is not, is exactly the advice that was correct for shipwrecked sailors, and exactly the advice their instincts overrode. The desert has not become safe. It has become supervised. And the supervision is precisely what makes the modern era look different, because it is the one part of the system that has genuinely improved. Somebody knows you went in. Somebody notices when you do not come out. Rangers patrol. Aircraft overfly. A distress call from a vessel goes to Walvis Bay Port Control, which stands a 24-hour watch on the international distress frequency and functions as a maritime rescue subcenter, working under the Coordination Center at Cape Town, with Namibian Search and Rescue and the South African organization cooperating across the border. There are helicopters in the country. There are salvage tugs on contract in the region. There are satellite distress beacons on ships that transmit an identity and a position automatically to a system that is monitored continuously, without anyone aboard having to do anything at all. Every one of the individual failures that nearly killed the people from the Dunedin Star has an answer now. So here is the test. Put a modern vessel on this coast in the conditions the coast specializes in, with a full crew, and let the modern system respond to it. Recognition, authorization, assets, transit, approach, transfer. And see which parts of the machine have actually been fixed and which parts have only been made faster. That test was run on the night of the 21st of March, 2018. The Fukuseki Maru No. 7 was a Japanese longliner working tuna. She had been fishing off Angola, and she was running south for Walvis Bay with a hold containing something like 70 tons of tuna, a catch reported at around 30 million rand, and roughly 130 tons of marine diesel in her tanks. Her crew were largely Indonesian, which is entirely ordinary in this fishery. The vessel is Japanese flagged and Japanese owned. The crew are hired internationally, and the boat works wherever the licenses and the fish are. The reported reason she was heading for port is the detail that gives this incident its shape. She was making for Walvis Bay because of a medical problem aboard. If that is right, and it is what Namibian reporting at the time carried, then everything about her track is explained without anyone doing anything unreasonable. A vessel with a sick crewman is a vessel with a clock running. You do not stand off and take the scenic route. You take the direct line, at the best speed you have, toward the only place on this coastline with a hospital, a quay, and an ambulance. And the direct line from the Angolan grounds to Walvis Bay runs down the Skeleton Coast. Visibility was poor. Of course it was. That is what this coast does. And the mechanism is the same one that took the Edward Bolen in 1909. Cold water, warm air, saturated marine layer, fog against a low shore with no lights on it. Nothing about that has changed. Nothing about it can change because the Benguela is not going to stop upwelling. What had changed was everything on her bridge. She had satellite positioning accurate to a few meters. She had radar. She almost certainly had electronic charts. She had an AIS transponder broadcasting her identity, position, course, and speed continuously to anyone with a receiver. In 1909, an officer in this situation had a compass, a clock, and an estimate. In 2018, he had, in principle, complete knowledge of where his ship was. She grounded anyway in the small hours on the shoreline near mile 108 south of the Ugab River mouth, in an area of submerged rock. Accounts place her variously at mile 108 and up by Cape Cross, which are different points on the same short piece of shore. The cause was reported as suspected navigational error in poor visibility. Sit with the phrase for a second, because it is doing a lot of work, and it is worth being honest about what we know and what we do not. There is no publicly available formal casualty investigation that I can point you to that establishes the sequence on that bridge. What is on record is a vessel with modern equipment on a well-known coast in bad visibility, ending up on rocks she had every technical means to avoid. The available evidence supports the general finding and does not support any specific story about who did what. But the general finding is the interesting one, because it repeats. Knowing your position with great precision does not save you if the danger is not where the chart says it is, or if the chart is derived from surveys nobody has redone, or if nobody is looking at the display, or if the display is showing a position that is correct while the ship is doing something the watchkeeper has not noticed. Fatigue is a factor on every small commercial vessel in the world. Crews are minimal, watches are long, and a boat running for port with a medical case aboard has probably had a bad night before the bad night. Precision is not attention. It never has been. And there is a specific technical trap that modern equipment has introduced on coasts exactly like this one, which is worth naming because it is invisible from outside the industry. An electronic chart display puts your ship on the chart as a symbol. The position of that symbol is very accurate. Satellite positioning is good to a few meters, and the accuracy is real. What is not necessarily accurate is the chart underneath it. Charts are compiled from surveys, and surveys have dates, and enormous stretches of the world's coastline are still charted from work, done with lead lines and sextants long before anybody thought about meter-level accuracy. A modern chart of a remote African coast may be a digital rendering of a survey nobody has repeated in a century. The rocks are drawn where a 19th century surveyor thought they were, so you can be perfectly certain of where you are and still be wrong about where the rock is. Precision on one side of the equation, antiquity on the other, and a display that shows both with identical crispness and no visible distinction between them. That is the Clan Alpine shoal problem, unchanged since 1890, wearing a screen. Then the modern machine started, and this is where the difference from 1942 becomes stark and specific. Recognition was immediate. A grounded vessel in 2018 does not need to persuade anyone that she exists. Her position was known. By AIS, by radio, by the simple fact that somebody aboard could use a satellite phone. There was no equivalent of the Dunedin Star's radio operator hoping the right listener was on the right frequency. Authorization was fast, and it had a structure. Namibian search and rescue coordinates through Walvis Bay Port Control acting as a maritime rescue subcenter, working with the South African Coordination Center, and the region has commercial helicopter operators contracted to support offshore work. The asset that responded was a Bell 212 flown by Starlight Aviation, with crews including the pilots Koos Myberg, Jacques Coetzer, and Andrew Abernethy. Transit was measured in an hour or two, not in days. That single sentence is the whole of the 20th century's contribution to this coast. Approach was the part that had not changed at all. The sea was breaking over her, not lapping. Breaking, in the full sense, green water coming across the vessel and down her length, in the same shallow, steepening, repeating swell that has been arriving on this shore from the Southern Ocean for as long as there has been a Southern Ocean. That single condition eliminated every option except one. No boat could come alongside. No line could be usefully worked from the beach. No tug could get in close enough to matter, because a tug that gets in close enough to matter on this coast becomes the Sir Charles Elliot. The helicopter hovered over a vessel that was being struck repeatedly by breaking waves and took people off it vertically on a wire, one at a time. A hoist is worth describing properly because it is the single technique that finally beat this coastline. A crewman goes down on a cable to a deck that is moving in 3 axes and is periodically underwater. He fits a strop around a person who has probably never worn one. The winch operator lifts them clear, keeping the cable from fouling on masts, aerials, rigging, gantries, and the long-line gear that a tuna boat is covered in. The pilot holds a hover over a fixed point relative to a wreck, while the wind does whatever the wind is doing and the spray comes up into the rotor disc. Then the aircraft repositions and does it again, and again. Everyone aboard was taken off and flown out. Reported crew figures differ slightly between accounts, 22 in the operator's own record, 24 in Namibian press reporting, and the survivors were landed at Walvis Bay and eventually sent home. Nobody died. Then came the salvage, and the salvage is where the coast gave its answer. There was a catch worth 30 million rand aboard, and 130 tons of diesel in the tanks, and a hull that had been afloat and fishing the day before. The Japanese salvage company Nippon Salvage was engaged. The tug Smit Amandla, one of the most capable salvage tugs operating in southern African waters, was positioned to pull her off if the salvors could lighten her enough to float. Aviation support continued because there was no other way to move a person or a piece of equipment onto that deck. The operator's own log gives the scale of it. Between the initial rescue and the 6th of April, one Bell 212 flew 226 hoists and 52 underslung loads over about 35 flying hours. Every tool, every pump, every salvor, every length of hose went onto that vessel, dangling from a helicopter, because the sea would not let anything approach on the surface. It did not work. The salvage was abandoned on the 9th of April. The stated reasons were the submerged rocky ground she was sitting on and the sea and weather conditions, which is a polite way of saying that the swell would not stop for long enough. She was written off. The diesel that escaped was a light, non-persistent grade that mostly evaporated and dispersed, and the pollution response contained the rest, and no oil came ashore, which is a genuinely good outcome and a real improvement on any previous era. She stayed on those rocks, breaking up in the surf, for 3 years. In 20,000 each 21, what remained of her was destroyed with explosives. Now compare the two ends of this story because the comparison is the point. In 1942, a stranded ship's crew and passengers spent weeks on that shore and weeks more getting out across the desert behind it. And it cost 2 lives, a tug, and an aircraft, and took a Navy, an Air Force, and a police convoy. In 2018, everybody was lifted off a vessel being overrun by breaking seas, within hours, by one helicopter, with no injuries and no fatalities. And in both cases, the ship was a total loss. That is the shape of what has changed here. The rescue problem has been solved, comprehensively, impressively, by people who are extremely good at their jobs and who go out and do it in conditions that would have been fatal to attempt 80 years ago. The grounding problem has not been solved at all. Ships still hit this coast for the same reasons in the same conditions. And once they hit it, the surf and the sandbars and the rock still make salvage close to impossible, which produces the last and worst reversal in this story. And it is one nobody intends. The graveyard is growing faster now precisely because survival has become routine. Think it through. When a wreck meant a good chance of dying, everything about the system pushed against grounding. Crews stayed further off. Owners were more cautious. And the losses that did occur were catastrophic enough to change behavior. Now a grounding on the Skeleton Coast is, for the people involved, a survivable event with a very high probability of a helicopter and a flight home. The human cost has collapsed. The cost to the hull has not moved at all, because nothing anyone has invented can get a stranded ship back off this beach. So the beach keeps the ships and gives back the crews. The hulls accumulate. The sand comes north and starts building around each new one, and the shoreline steps out. And in a few decades, the newest wreck is a few hundred meters inland with cormorants on it, and somebody photographs it and calls the coast haunted. It is not haunted. It is just extremely good at one specific thing, so let me put the machine together, because none of these pieces is dangerous on its own, and all of them together have been taking ships for 500 years, without a single change to the method. Geography sets the constraints, and it sets them before any weather arrives. 500 kilometers of shore, with no harbor, no anchorage, and no lee, removes the option of running for shelter. A hinterland with essentially no rain and no surface water removes the option of walking out. Those two facts alone convert every incident on this coast from a maritime problem into a survival problem. And they were true in 1533, and they are true tonight. The current activates them. The Benguela pulls cold water up along the shelf, and cold water under warm desert air makes fog that can sit on this coast for most of the year and push 50 kilometers inland. The same wind that drives the upwelling drives the swell, and the swell arrives from the Southern Ocean with nothing in its way. The same current sets ships north and quietly corrupts every position estimate made without a fix. The shore itself supplies the force. Long swell running into shallow water gets shorter and steeper until it topples, and it topples onto sandbars that move from season to season on a bottom nobody has ever properly surveyed. A hole that touches that bar is not in the sea anymore. She is in the impact zone, taking a strike every 10 seconds from the same direction, and she will not be coming off. Human motive supplies the exposure, and it never runs out. Portugal needed a route to India. Guano traders needed nitrogen. A colonial army needed horses. Britain needed ammunition in North Africa and could not use the Mediterranean. Miners needed diamonds out of beach gravel. And now a fishing industry needs a quota landed before a season closes, in the most productive water on the continent, which happens to be a few kilometers off the worst shoreline on it. Equipment changes the choices, and the change is never in the direction people assume. Steam removed the fear of a lee shore and put ships closer to it. Radar answered a question this coast does not ask. Precision navigation converted position accuracy into proximity, and a factory trawler with the best instruments on the coast went on to the rocks at Maua Bay on her first voyage. Better tools have consistently bought more exposure than margin, and that is not a failure of the tools. It is what people do with capability everywhere, in every industry. Distance limits the rescue, and it is the only variable that has never moved. Walvis Bay to the northern wrecks is 2 days by sea. Windhoek to the coast was 9 days by truck in 1942 and is still 600 kilometers of desert. Cape Town is 1,500 kilometers by air. Helicopters have compressed that from days to hours, which has saved a great many lives. And ours is still the floor. And the first 30 seconds of an emergency, when a davit fails or a lifeboat is swamped, will always happen with the nearest help still on the ground somewhere else. And the surf closes the loop. It delivers people ashore alive and will not let them back out. It pins hulls where no tug can reach them. It has, over 5 centuries, produced the coast's signature result with unnerving consistency. The people live, and the ship stays. The Bom Jesus lost a hull's worth of cargo and left behind a few bone fragments, and we still do not know whether anyone from her walked out of that beach or died on it, because the coast does not keep that kind of record. Everyone on the Dunedin Star survived, and the 2 men who died were rescuers on another ship 100 kilometers away. 3 men from a timber carrier drowned in the last 30 meters, alongside a vessel that was already aground. 20-odd men were lifted off a tuna boat in 2018 by a helicopter crew, who then spent 3 weeks trying and failing to save the boat, which brings me to the claim in the title, and I am not going to leave it standing without qualification. You will hear that this is the world's largest ship graveyard. It might be. Nobody can demonstrate it. The numbers you will see quoted, over 500, over 1,000 thousands, are estimates layered on estimates, and there is no authoritative register anywhere that lists the wrecks on this coast, because compiling one would mean systematically surveying 500 kilometers of restricted, roadless shoreline where a substantial and unknowable fraction of the wrecks are already under the beach. A former park ranger photographed 112 of them over 6 years of working the coast. That is the sort of number a person actually counted. Everything above it is inference. The reputation is real. The audit does not exist. And the reason it does not exist is itself a property of the place. This coast hides its own evidence at the rate of a few meters of new beach per wreck per decade. using sand it imported from the Orange River 400 kilometers to the south, which is what it is doing right now. 14 kilometers south of Henties Bay, at the place the local fishermen call Diwala, the Zayla is standing in the surf where the tow line left her in August 2008. She is a red-brown shell now. The plating is going, and you can see straight through her in places where the frames have opened up. And the swell runs into her from the southwest and comes out the other side in a mess of white water that has not stopped since the day she arrived. Cormorants stand along her rail with their wings out. In the morning she is in fog, and the fog does the thing it has always done here, which is to make the water and the sky and the beach the same color and leave the hull as the only object with an edge. Behind her on the shoreside, the sand is building. It always is. She is a groin now, the way the Edouard Bolin was a groin in 1909, catching the drift as it moves north, and the beach in her lee is a little wider each year. Given long enough, and there is no reason to think she will not be given it, the water will be somewhere else, and the Zayla will be standing in dry desert with people photographing her from a road, and someone will explain that she was driven inland, which will not be true. The land will have come out to her. 20 kilometers offshore, after dark, you can see the fishing lights. That is the part that closes it for me. Not the wreck, the lights. Because every one of those is a working boat with a crew and a quota and a bank loan out there tonight in the same water, on the same coast, doing the same job, for the same reason people have always been out there. The Benguela is the richest water anywhere on this coast. And it is the machine that makes the fog. And it is not going to stop being either. They will come in with the catch. Most of them always do.